Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Tabletopped. We are deep into January of 2025. And earlier this month, you heard a re-release of an episode I did with Matt from Roleplay Chat to start off the year strong because our conversations are so good. And I thought, you know what? I want to get Matt back on so that we can talk again and keep that going. So, Matt, welcome back to Tabletopped. How you doing?
Oh, I'm great, Nick. It's really nice to be back. Thanks for having me. The invitation it brought the warm fuzzies to my heart to come back and chat. And I'll have to have you come back and join me on Roleplay Chat
Absolutely.
for season 6.
You know that the door's always open, baby. You got a free pass.
I appreciate that. But yeah. No, new year, new Matt, new role playing games. Let's go. I'm excited to talk games.
Yeah, do you have any resolutions when it comes to TTRPGs for this year? We kind of did a little bit of that earlier in the month for ourselves, but do you have one that you're sort of having the chamber?
Oh boy, I don't know. I mean, I have one. Maybe it's a little too hot off the press, but I'm working on a small supplement that I'm trying to crank out the door. So that for me, 2025 is the year that gets completed.
Yeah,
I've got a lot of it written out, but I've done none of the behind the scenes work, the layout and getting an artist and all that stuff, which is presumably the harder part.
Franco and I made a rules agnostic module at the end of last year, and we have an ash can.
That was super cool,
right?
By the way. Yeah.
We have the ash can version up, but like you said, it's actually really hard, it turns out, to make a product that looks nice and is up to your standards and has cool art that you've paid someone for. And all that stuff just takes a lot of time.
Definitely. It takes a lot of time, and you want to do something that warrants the people who buy, the money that the people are going to spend on it. It's got to be worth that $5.99 or the $7.99. And I feel like I want to do justice to the people that might purchase it, and that's hard. It's got to look good, like you're saying. It's got to have the art. It's got to be novel enough to warrant having that kind of price tag on it. So we'll see if I get there. I don't know.
Yeah. I had a friend who said he is not a TTRPG person, but he picked up a TTRPG book recently because he was like, man, the art is so cool. The lore is so cool. And he's like, I bet that a lot of people pick these supplements and these systems up because they just want to have the inspiration that comes from reading a really well thought out and in-depth piece of lore / system and all of the implications that comes out of it. And I was thinking about that, and I think that that's right. I think that people, because it's all folk tradition, you can kind of play this kind of game that we have fallen in love with any way you want. You don't need anything. However, I think that the reason why people have, after all these years, still been picking stuff up is for that reason. So yeah, gotta do them justice.
That's it. That either the lore stuff, or I think maybe what we might get to talk into about today is they want a shortcut, or they don't have the time to pump into creating something right away. So having a tool that can help you do it with a minimum amount of preparation or a minimum amount of that behind the scenes work. To me, those are the two reasons I go to pre-published content, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And you kind of mentioned it right there, but for our dear listener, off mic, Matt and I were talking about what we wanted to chat about today. And we were kind of thinking it's a new year. Both Matt and I are super underwater when it comes to our personal lives. And we're just how do we play games with little to no prep? What does a low prep session look like? How does it run? How do you put your best foot forward so that your players are having a good time? And Matt, I heard from you that you're kind of starting to implement some of these ideas into your home game that you've been running for quite some time. So how is that going? What has been the reason for the shift, and how have you kind of gone about it? We'll level set there and then kind of build.
Yeah, totally. So for me, it's kind of been a mix of two things. One, as somebody who loves games, I want to keep running games, but in my personal life, I'm working my way up that corporate ladder, and the workload that comes with that It definitely has increased. And as being a father of two children, two lovely, beautiful children that I love very much, but they do take away from, my free time and my spare time to prepare for games. And I don't mean to say that those are the only reasons. Like, other people can have their own reasons for not wanting to prepare for a long amount of time, including simply not wanting to spend more than 15 or 20 minutes to get ready for a game. And I
Yeah.
think that that's a perfectly valid reason. So my objective over the course of the past year or so with my home game that we meet up once every 2 weeks, we play for about 2.5 to 3.5 hours in a
Hmm.
session. I kind of challenged myself. How can I keep running this game and to a standard of fun that like I like to keep quite high? Like, I want my players to
Yeah.
come feel like the game is immersive and engaging and
Hmm.
entertaining, and that there's still interesting plot twists. There's still narratives that, through threads and narratives that are going on throughout the game. How do I achieve that without sinking in 3, 4, 5 hours of prep time for these games, which is something that I used to do and I used to enjoy doing, but I'm not there anymore. I can't do that anymore. So how do I keep the standard still high enough? Maybe not quite as high as what it used to be, but still high enough. Um, and I feel like I found some interesting strategies. Some
Hmm.
hopefully people listening can adopt for themselves. I'd love to hear your thoughts too, Nick. If you have little tools in the toolbox, because I'm always looking for more things to add
Yeah.
to my repertoire to kind of keep the game engaging.
Yeah, I mean, this is the weird thing is that both of you and I think, DM very similarly in that we put a lot of onus on story and engagement of players, and we're always trying to like pull them in deeper into the world. Um, I have, and as a player, that's what I'm looking for as well. My favorite game that I've ever been a part of was run by my friend Mac, who has been on the podcast several times. Mac is just like a very gifted storyteller, a very good improviser. Every single one of his games has been little like no prep or low prep. And they have been some of the most rewarding stories that I've ever had at a table. So I think that it's like, it is definitely possible. Like, you can do this. I think that what the thing that I struggle with, because I do this as well, I'm not very good at prepping. I don't like having a huge encyclopedia, because then I feel like I'm like failing a test because I'm not saying the exact thing that I
Mm-hmm.
wrote down or whatever it is. And I constantly am like, if I leave too many like super specific things in there, if I mess it up or I misspeak and I ruin something, I feel like I failed. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, I
One,
know that
yeah,
very well, very well. In fact, that's
yeah.
mostly why I stay away from prepared modules, because I
Mm.
always feel like, oh, I'm going to fail the test. I'm going to not do
Yeah.
the module the justice that it deserves. Anyway, I interrupt you. Please keep going.
No. But it's so important, because I think that what doing games in a more improvised fashion does for you is it allows you to take some of that pressure off and be more in the moment with your players. And by doing that, you can create more interesting and emotional scenes, because that's what scene
Mm-hmm.
work is. It's like very much, listening and reacting and really like taking what your player is telling you, internalizing that, and then speaking truthfully, and then the story is going to emerge from there. A lot of like improv basics will be like, the yes and the
Mm-hmm.
no but and all that kind of stuff. I think that if you are working in a way where you are not tied to a specific outcome, and you have a broad idea of where you want to take your characters emotionally, that if you prepare in that way mentally, you actually don't have to do a lot of prep. Um, the thing that I fall down a bunch with is the mechanics of the game getting in the way of that, and specifically with D&D, prepping combat, I feel like, is something like you can't really get around that. You have to have stat blocks, and you have to have like the initiative order, and you have to make sure that if you're doing like traps or whatever, that it's going to be fair and fun and interesting. And in that way, I feel like D&D doesn't always love you to not prepare, but I think that it's doable, because my friend Mac did it. It's very possible. You just have to prioritize different things than in like a traditional well-prepared game. Does that make
Yeah.
sense? Like, do
Well,
you think that
100%.
feels good?
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. And I think there's definitely kind of like going back to the state of mind thing that you were talking about. I feel like there was a specific shift that I had to take on myself. So maybe this is the first piece of advice is like you kind of have to flick a switch in your own head to be like, you know what? I'm not going to come into this with an enormous sandbox or
Yeah.
the next time that, the group goes to the city that I haven't fleshed out yet, I'm not going to spend 5 hours drawing out a map and thinking up the 7 main factions interacting here or the main through thread of the like villains, big bad arc like story or whatever. I'm not going to think about that. I have to make an active decision to only think of it if and when it becomes relevant to the immediate actions of the party.
Yeah.
So to do, basically what I've been doing is slowly taking that time down. So what I used to spend maybe 3 hours fiddling around with and preparing and I want to make it very clear to the listeners too that just because I was preparing all this stuff, it didn't mean I anticipated needing it.
Yeah.
I was kind of doing this for myself to be able to kind of pull it out when relevant. And I've had to hone in on this ability to effectively come up with just enough content for every game.
Yeah.
And really think of like, okay, we're going to play for 3 hours. What does that look like? Truly. Like really, if my party is right now they're at the inn and they've already vocalized that their plan was to travel along the main road and meet this one important NPC to deliver her a letter 5 days down the road, like in game time.
Yeah.
If they've already told me that that's kind of what they're anticipating, that what they think they're going to be doing, I should only be planning like, okay, there's maybe going to be a fun interaction as they wake up in the morning at the tavern. Maybe, the city guard barges in with a burglar all bundled up and the burglar makes his way loose and they have to, catch him without hurting him so the guards can put him back in prison. There you go. That's like an hour of the 3 hours done. The next thing they're going to, walk along the road. Maybe we'll fast travel along the road and I'll have the party members talk to one another and I'll like probe them with some questions to have inter-party roleplay. That's the next hour gone. And then we'll have an interesting scene when they arrive at their destination. Maybe they see the person that they were trying to deliver the letter to. She's hurt and they need to figure out why she's hurt, or even better, she is like actively engaged in some kind of conflict. Let's end the night on a cliffhanger where we don't know if that character survives. Bada boom, bada bing. There's our 3.5 hours of gameplay. And like, literally, that's all the preparation I would do. I would write down like that train of thought, maybe come up with, like you were saying, a couple of stat blocks. Like I'd be like, okay, look up this character stat block on this page and I'd write it down. And then those would be my game notes.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have to be ready to adapt to the party changing their mind. And if that happens, then that happens. But hopefully they stay true to their intentions. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, I think that you're so right that because the shift that you're describing is to think of scenarios rather than stories. You know what I mean? Like what you're saying is like, okay, so it is an interesting thing to have happened if a burglar is brought in by a city guard all tied up and like breaks free and they have to figure that out. Like that is just a situation that they are then getting to play in. And like you said, anything you want to do, anything if you want to resolve it in D&D specifically takes an hour.
yeah, exactly.
And then I think that's like so smart. Like, so I just started GMing for a group of comedy writers and performers, and I kind of went in being like, oh shit, these are all storytellers and I'm going to get screwed. Like something bad is going to happen and they're going to call me on it. But then the best thing is that your mistakes that you make, if you think about them, can turn into like the best parts of the game. Like, for example, the first thing I wanted to do, they were in this mountain, like inside this hollowed out mountain. It's a city called Hollow Plain. They were running around, and they all did sort of character introductions at the session 0, so everyone kind of knew where people were starting off. And in the session 0, I had basically this like robed figure come to them, and I'll give them a black envelope that basically said, hey, meet at this place tonight, break into this place, and I'll pay you 500 gold. And they were like, okay. And so like they all had their own little interactions with that. But then like after in session 1, basically I was like, okay, so what comes out of that? They have to go in. These are the scenarios I'm going to set them up so they can play around in. They bounce out. And then one of them was like, so where do we collect our gold? And I was like, shit, I didn't put a character name on there or whatever. I didn't have a specific person ready for them. I was just trying to get them all really hooked into the scenario. And so in the moment I just said, yeah, you don't know. And they were all like, oh shit, have we been had?
Yeah, we got bamboozled.
Yeah, we got bamboozled. And then they were all like, okay, so if they're not planning to pay us, then why were we chosen? Why did we find this stuff while we were doing that? And basically what came out is they're like, oh shit, we're being framed. Like something bad is about to happen. And I sort of leaned into it. I kept going with them. Your players are going to direct the story. As long as you're able to like, lean with them, your worst mistakes of not being specific can become really cool things. And I think that is the thing, is like, just don't panic.
Definitely don't panic. Lean into what your players have to say. What the ideas that they come up with 9 times out of 10 are better than the ideas that I can come up with. So, you lean into those, or you even better, you take them and you just twist them a little bit. You make them a slight variation on what they were expecting.
That's so smart. Yeah.
And it goes a long way. Like for instance, right now, my party suspects that there is some kind of fraud happening within their organization. They think that there's like somebody who's doing something bad, and they're trying to figure out who it might be. Yeah. And this was all an idea that they came up with. Like I put them as part of this adventuring guild, and I was having stuff happen. And at some point they were like, man, this is super fishy. Like, how is it that the cultists that are our main rivals in this whole scenario, how is it that they're always like involved and they're always like around the bend and somehow they're there? And I mean, secretly between you and I, Nick, they're just there because I was trying to fill fill space in the game. You're like,
I got these cultist stat blocks. Let's throw them in there.
Yeah, exactly. And I did that maybe 1 or 2 too many times, and then they started to realize that there must be somebody who's like a mole and is feeding information to the cultists. Well, now I've turned that into a whole narrative arc in the game where the leading members of this organization, who there are 4 of, there is now reason to suspect 2 of them. And I've kind of made them do suspicious things where now not only is there perhaps 1, there are 2, or better yet, we have to find out which one of the 2 is the bad one without upsetting the good one, So how are we going to snoop around and learn intel about the founders of our guild without getting in trouble? So anyway, you take what they're giving you, you twist it a little bit, and you give it back. And that's usually the best part.
That's so well said. I hadn't thought of it that way, but you're 100% correct. It's basically like an escape room where if you get it and it's exactly what you thought, you're like, oh, I nailed it. I'm like a genius.
Yeah, exactly.
But then it's even better when you're like, I think it could be this, and then you dig a little deeper and you're like, I'm almost there, and then the discovery is the pleasurable part of the experience. And I think that that's exactly what you provide them by saying like, oh, they're saying that this is really interesting to them. They're like, ooh, something's tingling. This feels like the way I'm supposed to go. I'm feeling like a genius. And then you just change it a little bit so they still get that bit of discovery inside of that Mwah, perfect.
Yeah, it's great. And I know, like, listening to us talk about this, if I were to like rewind time, and me as a game master 5 years ago, hearing two people talking about this conversation, I would be so tempted to try to make that happen through preparation. And this is me telling me from 5 years ago, don't. Like, you literally have to just let it happen. You have to sit back, you have to go into the game, like you were saying, Nick, with ears open for what your players are thinking about, what they're talking about, what's important to them, and be comfortable kind of not knowing where the story is going to go and letting it kind of ride out. And every now and then you're going to throw in a couple of things that even you don't know about. An NPC with some weird kind of motivation, or a character who you save from a battle who, like, in their dying breath, they whisper to you, like, find the mother of the trees, and then he dies. And I don't know who the mother of the trees is, but now they're obsessed with it, and that becomes the whole, like, next thing that they're going to do. So
yeah, no, and I think that also comes from, like, prioritizing your players' additions to the game as well. Like you said, there is a habit, I think, that GMs have where they're like, I want to control it. I want to tell a story. But the thing is that you actually stumble into better stuff most of the time. Like, most GMs aren't professional writers. They're not professional storytellers. And the people sitting down at your table are not either. And so what you're actually looking for are small moments of truth that you can then just kind of link together loosely. For example, so in that game, this person, her name in the game is Bird Bones. She's like the scion of a thief family that runs one of the two main thief guilds in this section of the city. She goes to her dad because she found that black envelope crumpled up by her dad, who runs the guild, and she found it and was like, ooh, I'm going to go do this because my sister's in prison. I want to get her out. And this says that the reward for doing this job will be to get my sister out. So she goes and does it. And then she realizes that, she finds these bags of gold coins that have her family symbol, like, sort of sewn onto them, but they're slightly wrong, as though somebody is kind of doing them, but not knowing the intricacies that make it the correct symbol. And she goes back to her dad. And again, I had not prepped for any of these interactions. I was just sort of like, the job's done. Where do you want to go?
Yeah.
So, yeah. And she goes back to her dad and was like, someone's trying to frame us. Someone's trying to frame us. Look at what I found when I was doing this thing. And in the moment, I was just sort of like, again, had not prepared for this interaction. And the dad was just like, kind of in the moment, I realized, like, the dad looks at her and says, what do you mean framed? You were there. It's not framing us. If you were there, why did you go there?
Yeah.
And so then it became a thing of like, oh shit, did I put my family in greater danger because I did this unthinking? And that is like a huge story trope that's like in every young adult novel ever, of like the brash, not intuitive, like not listening to your parents and all that kind of stuff. And now that's a huge part of the plot. They're in a situation where they're reaping consequences from this. And now they're all terrified. They can't leave town because they're like, our family is here. Like, what are we going to do? And that's where this story is building from. So like, I really, like you said, I encourage people to just like think about what's true. If this is true, what is also true? And then just do that. You don't have to prep anything. You don't have to guide them. Just take what they say. And if that is true, what else is true? And you're going to find great stuff, like amazing stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And I think too, Nick, something that can maybe sound intimidating. I mean, for you and I think NPCs and narrative, like that's a lot of the stuff that comes naturally to us.
Yeah.
But there are certainly things that don't come naturally to me, and kind of being able to know what those things are, and, names, man, I'm awful at coming up with names. So having the right tables in my game master screen goes a long way. Coming up with, 15 or so names that are randomly generated or that I try to think of ahead of time for characters from a specific region of the world that might have like common consonants or whatnot in them so that it remains consistent. I'll have that. I'll have like dwarf names, elf names, dragonborn names, whatever it is, like depending on where we're going. I'll think of that ahead of time. I'll tape it to the back of my game master screen, and now that's going to be a crutch I can lean on when inevitably I have to name somebody out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Or another, I have a couple of these things where like I know my weaknesses. So magic items or spells, man, I'm bad at spells. So I'll have like a handful of spells that I think are interesting or could create like a fun moment in the game. I tape them to the back of my game master screen. Like I said, names is something that I'm quite bad with. Treasure tables that are relevant to, like, I have a party member who likes bows and arrows. I'll come up with a list of interesting things that they can shoot out their arrow and put them in this table, so that when it comes time to improvise that stuff, I have something to lean on.
Mm-hmm.
Making a fun NPC interaction happen, that I can do without a table.
Yeah.
But a stat block or something, no. I need to have a page number written down of character. Like, that's actually something that I did with just the basic monster manual. I went in and I found a handful of monsters of range of a couple of ranged monsters, a couple of upfront brutish monsters, a couple of solo monsters, and I just wrote down the character, like the page number and a descriptor. Solo monster, page whatever, 145. And then what I'll do is, if we come across a situation where they need to fight a big troll in the forest or a wounded hill giant or whatever, I'll just take the stat block of the same thing and reskin it. They don't need to know it's the same stat block. I'm using that as a guideline. Okay, it has about 100 HP. Okay, it has about 3 attacks per turn. Maybe it's a spellcaster, so it has this, that, and the other spell. That can be very helpful. And my players are not super number crunchy, so they're not going to be like, oh, it's a troll, it's definitely got 74 HP. Like, they're not gonna know. And I'm just spouting out numbers. I'm sure somebody listening is like, oh, no, a troll has this much. I'm sorry, I don't know how much HP it normally has, but it allows me to very quickly on the fly have an encounter, like a combat encounter, happen without me being like, okay, everybody, like, hang on, I gotta go look up the stat block for, a hag or whatever. No, I've got stuff that I can work with at my fingertips. So figure out what you're not good at, and make sure that you create the crutches you need to make sure that you can do them on the fly. Basically.
Man, I feel you about names. Names are the worst. I hate them so much. I do the same thing where I come up with like 10 of them and I just put them on a piece of paper in front of me. And as soon as I use one, I just put a little check mark next to it. And I'm like, okay, that's the one. That's it. And sometimes I'm like, okay, orc. And I like just put a thing. Yeah, I think that's really smart, is that, like, if you are going to prep or you're in a low prep situation, prep for your weaknesses. You can handle your strengths. You're a very interesting person. You're running a game which makes you story inclined or rules inclined, and that means you have some strengths. Just try to think about, like, when am I most uncomfortable behind the screen, and just prep a little bit for that. And I think that you're pretty much good. I really like the idea of having stat blocks that you just, like, basically throw a skin over. I think that's very fun. I also, sometimes I come up with like puzzles, essentially, like situations where I'm like, okay, because personally as a player, I hate just straight combat. I find it very boring. D&D is not my like preferred combat mechanism, because if you want a more interesting tactical experience, you're probably going to want to play like a war game. And if you want something a little bit more cinematic, you're going to want to use a more cinematic system. But I love when there is a skill aspect or like a creativity aspect nested within a combat.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, my friend Mac did this amazing thing once, and I'm probably going to use it, just steal straight from him. Again, that's another thing to do. Just steal, like, oh, wait, I remember I did that game, and like this situation was really fun. Just steal it. It's great. He did a situation where there was this house that was floating, and there was a magical item that if it touched the house, like basically fairies were flying within it. It was like a suit of armor or something. As soon as the armor touched the ground, it would sap all of the magic out of the house and it would start plummeting to the ground.
Oh my
And
gosh,
like
cool.
this person was just like, ha ha ha, like, isn't this amazing? We're like nobles, no one can hurt us. And so they had this thing going on as like a show of power. But during this fight, one of the fairies or something got tired or failed a test, and so the suit of armor fell. And then it became, okay, we're fighting, and we're also plummeting at 500 feet a second. And it's like,
Love it.
just come up with those situations and then just apply them to situations where it makes sense. I think that you're right. Just like having a sheet of something that can just help you out in a pinch is like the only real prep that you need. And it's like kind of evergreen. You can use it whenever it comes up, and you don't have to use it ever if it doesn't feel right,
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think making combat or making anything in your game stand out is fun. And I think what makes it stand out is like a memorable moment or a memorable scene. So trying to think of that, right? Again, if we have our 15 minutes of preparation time before we can get ready for a game, trying to think of like what would be a cool cinematic moment. If I was watching tonight's episode of the game, what would I want to like be looking at? Oh, well, it's them trying to cross the gully. They're like throwing the rope across. They've hooked their hook shot or whatever in the nook of a rock, and everybody but one person is crossing on this rope, and then a monster comes out of nowhere and starts to attack the one person who's guarding the rope, and everyone's got to hurry to the other side. And maybe it's a simple monster, like make it like a rust monster or some like roper or something straightforward. But in this context, it becomes interesting. It becomes memorable. So trying to think of those cool moments a little bit ahead of time, and then trying to curate the rest of the game to lead you to that scenario, that's all you need to do. And just do that in sequence over and over and over again. And the rest of it, as long as you're listening to your players, as long as you're building on some of the stuff that perhaps you improvised the first night or the third night or the seventh night as they come back, that's what creates your through tread that I used to work so hard to make, and now it's kind of making itself. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
It totally does. I think that for folks who are saying like, okay, that would take me 3 hours or whatever, because again, both of you and I have done this a while. We can kind of just throw this stuff together a little bit. Of course, like I find combat being where I spend all my prep time, just because I'm like, I got to make this interesting so that, if this goes long, if the pace of play slows down, it's because they're super engaged and not because they're waiting for their turn. Like that's like my kind of thought around using D&D in that way. However, I think that if you are like, man, that's going to take me 3 hours, I just want to do like a no prep game. I think that instead you just say, okay, what's the location? They're in a library. Okay, they're in the library. Okay, books. The books are attacking them. How does that work? Okay, well, the books are flying off the shelves at them. Is that a magical effect? Great. So now you have a kind of mix of a combat where these books are flying out of the shelves and hitting them, and maybe as soon as they hit them, they fall inert. But until they hit them, they're flying around trying to do damage. And then it's like also kind of a skill challenge in that, like, okay, why are these books flying out of the bookshelves at us? And then just let them figure it out. Truly, I think that this is like the biggest cheat code in all TTRPGs. Is like you set up that situation, do not have an answer, and feel okay saying yes to when they come up with a solution. A lot of again, for me 5 years ago, it would be like, how do I make sure that they're wrong a few times before they get it right? Like how can I like prove that this is a hard challenge, like a thing that they have to outsmart and they have to be wrong before they get right? You don't have to do that. If they're like, oh my God, I bet there's like a sigil inside the bookcase that's shooting these magic. It's like a trap. Yeah, that's right. Guess what? They wrote it for you.
Yeah. Or something that I like to do, Nick, in that, let's use that as an example. Something that I've been doing a lot now that I'm improvising more of my games is whenever my players want to know something like that, I make them roll some kind of check. I make them, unless it's like innately tied to their character's backstory or whatever, they want to know why the books are flying around. Okay, everybody at the table roll me an Arcana check.
Yeah.
Everybody rolls. Whoever has the highest number, I'm going to say, okay, you're going to know this. I pull them aside. We leave the table, and then I tell them, you rolled. Hopefully somebody rolled pretty high. I'll
Yeah.
say, hey, you know what? You rolled a 19. Before I even tell you anything, you're allowed to ask me a question, and I'll tell you honestly
Yeah.
about this thing. And usually they'll be like, well, I want to know, is this like necrotic in some way? Yes, it is. It's definitely it's definitely the same kind of magic the cultists were using last time.
Yeah.
Oh, it's the cult now, and there you go. And off we go to the races.
Yeah.
I completely BS that, but they are involved. And what's even more fun is now only they know that. So then we go back to the table, and now as we're playing, the combat is unfolding. That character is like, everybody watch out, it's necrotic damage, we gotta find, there's probably a necromancer somewhere. They'll role play that out to the rest of the table. And
Yeah.
you can do this in scenarios that aren't combat, right? You can do this in a scenario where they're doing research, or they're trying to find something in a room, or they're investigating a mystery or whatever. Pulling aside the player with the highest score, giving them the answer either you've prepared or you've been able to improvise, or you let them ask you a question and you can kind of use that as the building block for where you're going with this. Not only does it feel special for that person, because now you've had this one-on-one moment with them, but then it brings them back to the table with kind of like a job to do. It's now their job to give this information out to the rest of the party. And sometimes the most interesting stuff happens where they don't say everything. They just say what they want to say.
Yeah.
Or they make shit up. I had once, my wife is notorious for this, where she says something and adds her own little twist to it. And it doesn't have to be I don't have to make that canon. It can be a lie that her character has made, and that just makes it far more interesting, long term,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that too, just don't I feel like we have in our, it's just the way that we're schooled and the way that our culture works, at least in the West, it feels like there's a right way and there's a wrong way. And if you said, yeah, it's necrotic energy, and they're like, oh my God, okay, I gotta tell everyone. They go back and they're like, this the books must be made of bone or something. It's necrotic or blah blah blah. It's you know what? Sure, that's great. What a weird way to take that. But yeah, just go with it. That's great. Or it's or you can have something going where it's oh, you it is. It's not bone though. It's all hair inside. It's bound with human hair. And you realize that this maybe is why there's been a missing persons case in town or whatever like that. You can do stuff and just tie it to things that you've dropped along the way. I think that's amazing. As we're kind of coming to the last quarter of our conversation here. And one thing that I want to really pick your brain out about with this sort of topic is a lot of people, they get into D&D or this type of storytelling because they've seen Critical Role or they've seen Dimension 20 or whatever of the Adventure Zone. And they have these kind of epic tales that have a beginning, middle, and end, and everything kind of flows from one to the other. Of course, they have teams of writers and it's their job and all that kind of stuff. But you can still have that in an improvised game, and you can have a really fulfilling story. I want to just kind of get your ideas of how do you make it so that it feels consistent and cohesive so that the players feel like they're moving from place to place, and it's not, they're just kind of okay, he's obviously floundering. He's just making shit up as we go. None of this stuff is connected to each other. How do you sort of try to make a narrative out of this improvised play? You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll say that for me, what works is having something to ground me in the world. So at the very beginning of all this, I took literally a piece of construction paper that my kids had lying around, and I drew a map of the province that we were going to start the game in. I wasn't specifically tied to the whole game happening here, but that's where we were starting. And, I drew a couple of rivers, some mountains at the top, a forest in the middle, and like seven towns that I peppered throughout it.
Mm-hmm.
Using a name generator, I gave names to each of these towns, and that's it. The map wasn't very pretty. It was literally just chicken scratch on a piece of construction paper.
Yeah.
But as we played the game, and now we've been playing this game for close to 2 years now, me improvising, started about halfway through, like the second half of that. But I started with this established space. There were there was a faction that the party was a member of. There was the adventuring guild called the Diamond Guild, and as you make things canon through improvisation, it's kind of a matter of remembering those things. And I'm notoriously bad for forgetting most of the stuff that I improvise. But as you play, even if you bring back 10% of the things, like 10% of the NPCs that you improvise, 10% of the enemies or conflict or whatever, and you pepper them in later on in a different part, that would kind of make sense for that faction to also be involved in this other town because, I don't know, it's close proximity, or perhaps there's a headquarters here. And as you improvise this stuff, it creates this woven fabric of the sandbox, even if you didn't intend it to be that way. So for me, that's kind of my advice, is by intermingling, that's probably the wrong word, by like throwing in these little bits of consistency, it all kind of weaves together. And to answer your question about a story, in an environment like this, you're gonna build up characters that are gonna repeat and come back, and those characters are slowly gonna have motivations be created. And that's something that I used to create right at the onset, and now I just kind of let those motivations happen on their own, and eventually those characters are going to strive to achieve those they're going to get close to like accomplishing the thing that they're trying to accomplish. Hopefully it goes against the things that your party is trying to accomplish. So that's kind of how I allow for like this climax, where there's like this opening scene that happens, game one, where the players are slowly just working their way through these quote unquote isolated adventures or quests that they're going on throughout the province that they're in. And by game 5 or 6, they've now seen the same 4 or 5 recurring NPCs that have sort of found their way back into the story, and they learn about that character's objectives perhaps, or there's a mystery seeping in, and now they want to find that out. And by the end of it, there's some kind of conflict where they go face to face with this villain or with this NPC and stop them or defeat them, and then there you go. That's your story. And I know that sounds like overly simplified and not very interesting, but it definitely is when you're being active about listening to what your players are doing, and you're kind of weaving it into that. If that makes sense.
I hadn't thought about it this way, but I think again you put it perfectly, where if you can bring back 10% of the things that you've said before, which is not a whole lot. Let's say you have a campaign. Let's say you have 100 NPCs. If 10 of them make another appearance, it feels like a cohesive story. And I think that that's absolutely right. Like and most of them you're already going to have from the get-go, because your players are going to say in their backstory, like, oh yeah, like this person is in town and like I know them or whatever. As long as that person kind of keeps making an appearance, or even just one more appearance in the story, it feels like they've been considered and that they are invested because of that. The only thing I would add on to your really well put way of thinking about it is just make sure that your player, like the story, if the story cannot happen without the players being there, it is a perfect story for them, because they feel like I am having an active role and I am shaping this world because of my existence. As long as, and I think that honestly, improvising helps you stay closer to that, rather than if you over prep and you're like, this grand thing is happening in the world and you're just cogs in the machine and you never, you're basically intruding your way into my story. It actually is a harder sell for your players to feel invested in, and like the story is amazing for them. Because if you're just like, yeah, you know what, this little town that you saved and like the thing that we've spent the last 3 months doing, none of it would have happened if you were not there. Like you are essential to what has happened in this town. Then your players are going to feel great. It doesn't have to even be like a world ending thing. It can just be, like I said, like a small town is being has a bandit problem, but the bandit problem, like it just keeps escalating because the players are trying to help the town. It becomes a whole thing. And then guess what? Your players have solved the region's like bandit problem as they've confronted the bandit king or whatever it is.
Yeah, totally. And Nick, I know we're running low on time, but I really like how you said like your players are going to come up with their own NPCs. Your players are going to come up with their own stuff. And if they don't, there's no harm in asking them to. Like this is something that I do almost every other game now, where whenever we get to a new place, I'll point like on the spot to one of the people at the table and say, hey, you've been here before. You might not as a person remember, but your character has been here before and they've interacted with somebody. Who do you want that to be? And then they'll say, oh, you know what? Like my old mentor who taught me how to fence lives here. And I want to go, like, I'd love to go talk to them. Perfect.
Yeah.
That's, I love that. Let's find a way how the fencing master who taught you, like, why they're here. So anyway, asking them point blank during the game to come up with stuff can be an interesting way to get their buy-in into the game and to create these recurrent NPCs. I've also done something that I can't take credit for. It was by someone who was on the show not too long ago called Ryan Immel, who does a lot of really cool stuff on Instagram. He does like terrain and stuff. But Ryan has this rumors mechanic where at the beginning
I've used this. It's so good. It's so
you
good.
Make everybody write a rumor of another character in the party. It can be true. It can be false. Who knows? You put it in a hat, you mix them together, and then you give them, you redistribute them out to people. And now all of the characters know a rumor about another character in the party. And it just creates this like fuel, this fuel for a roleplay fire that can happen at any time. So doing those kinds of things, like getting them to make rumors, telling them to have these one-on-one like reveals of information, ask people how they feel about something in the moment. How does their character react? What does their character internalize when a character like an NPC dies, or you just got out of an interesting puzzle and they discovered cool information? Like this kind of like piggybacks a little bit more on like role-playing advice for perhaps newer game masters or players who aren't very vocal about like their characters' motivations. But I think it's good to like prompt people. Don't be afraid to prompt your players.
Offload that shit. Yeah. Just give it to them. And you can do that for everything. Like, don't make it like your players are responsible for everything. That's no fun. But like if you're in a world that you're homebrewed or whatever and you're like low prep, I've come up with a basic concept and someone's like, yeah, I'm an elf. What kind of gods do elves worship? And you're like, what gods do elves worship? Wow, what a great way to let your player be like, yeah, there's this god named Tavish and he's a great huntsman or blah, 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 blah. Write it down. You've got some backstory for the elves in your world. And I do this all the time. I don't do it all the time with NPCs, but I do it all the time with locations. Cool. Like you're in a town and I'm like, on your way into town, you spot 3 stores. What are they? And I just write those down. And like, because that is going to be what they're interested in seeing in the town,
Definitely.
Yeah. Matt, this is such a great conversation. I'm so happy to have you back. This has always been I'm always glad to have you here. And we definitely need to dive in. I want to hear more about how this is going to go for you. How you said you've been doing this for like a year now, right?
Yeah. I think I've found a good stride. Like I'm in a happy place where 15 to 30 minutes of preparation for a game if I want to and have the energy to get to that. I can go to the game and have like maybe a cool extra handout to give the players. Or
Yeah.
you know what? Sometimes I show up to a game and I've got nothing. I've got nothing except for perhaps some like shower thoughts in the past like 2 weeks between when we stopped playing and now. And that's when you like throw something to the players for 20 minutes, be like, okay guys, let's write a new rumor, and then and then you think about other stuff. But no, it's been going really well, and I hope my players are still having just as much fun. They haven't told me otherwise, so to me that's a good sign, and we'll see how it goes. For sure.
I'm so glad you brought up the rumor jar. I that's kind of a new addition to my table. It happened probably like 6 months ago. I saw the same thing you were talking about, and it's my favorite way to punish skill checks. Of like, if you fail, we're just gonna keep the story moving. But maybe it's like, you fail and you break a window and the alarms go off, and I write down and I'm like, okay, I'm writing down not a very good thief or whatever, and I wrote it, I put it in the thing, and then when they just meet some random guy, I pull out a random rumor, and I'm like, how does this person feel about him? Not a very good thief. Hey, I heard you're like that guy who messed up that stupid window job. Like, why did you break that guy's window? And then it's like, there you go. You have a point of view. The character's off. It's fun. So I'm glad you brought that up.
That's a good time. No, but thank you, Nick. This has been a lot of fun. It's just fun to kind of riff and chat and bounce ideas. So I still have a lot to say actually about improvised games and low prep stuff. And I wonder, and here I'm doing it live, and this is probably the biggest no-go ever, but would you want to come on Roleplay Chat and we can continue the conversation there?
Yeah, let's do a part 2. That's going to be awesome. I would love to do that.
Let's do it.
Yeah, so everyone subscribe to Matt's show, Roleplay Chat. It's awesome. I mean, Brendan Lee Mulligan was on it at one point, so you got to know it's high quality. So everyone go subscribe there, and when your new season starts up, hopefully we'll be able to continue this chat, because I feel like we have more to say as well.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Nick. It's been a pleasure. And please make sure you all go and buy Nick's Patreon like exclusive content, and make sure you listen to everything that he's pumping out for the show, because Tabletopped is definitely one of the best advice role-playing game podcasts.
Wow, you're too kind and exactly on message. Patreon.com/Tabletopped. You can go there. We have an extra episode every month. We also have the stuff that we were talking about earlier, like that module Franco and I made. You can also go to our website, tabletopppod.com. We have a contact form there if you want us to talk about anything specific, or you're like, I like what that Matt guy had to say. Have him back on. Feel free to write us. We'll definitely do it. And everyone, we will talk to you all next week for another episode of Tabletopped. Goodbye.
Bye, everybody.